My dad married just 3 months after my mom passed away and now tells me to give my room to my stepsister and move out. So I said okay, packed my bags, and moved to my uncle's house. Now dad's going mad and doing everything he can to convince me to come back because he just received something unexpected in the mail. My mom passed away about 6 months ago after a long battle with cancer. She was my rock, and we had an incredibly close bond. Losing her was devastating. I'm 19, and up until recently, I had been living with my dad, who, until this happened, was my source of stability. My parents' marriage wasn't perfect, but it was functional enough that I thought they were happy. Losing my mom made our little family feel so much smaller, and for a while, it was just dad and me trying to figure out life together. Then, 3 months after mom's death, my dad dropped a bombshell. He was getting remarried. I was stunned. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. To me, it seemed like he was rushing things. I mean, just a few months ago, we were grieving together, and now he was ready to move on. He claimed that this woman was an old friend, someone he had reconnected with shortly after mom got sick. I wanted to be open-minded. I understood that everyone grieves differently, and maybe this was his way of coping. But deep down, it felt wrong. It felt like he was disrespecting my mom's memory by jumping into a new relationship so quickly. When I tried to express this to him, he launched into a speech about how he deserved to be happy after everything he had been through. My heart sank. I didn't want to start a fight, so I kept quiet. I was trying to be mature, to avoid conflict, but inside, I was a complete wreck. It was so hard to watch him move on while I was still processing my own grief. It felt like he had replaced my mom with someone new, and I didn't know how to deal with those feelings. Jane, his new wife, moved in almost immediately, along with her 17-year-old daughter, Emily. I didn't know much about Emily, but I could see how close she and her mom were. They seemed to have this bond that I felt completely left out of. Jane was always pleasant, smiling, trying to be friendly, but I could sense she was subtly trying to assert her dominance over the household. Suddenly, there were new house rules, changes to our routines, and shifts in how everything worked. The familiar comfort of home was gone, replaced by an uncomfortable atmosphere that made me feel like a stranger in my own space. At first, I tried to go with the flow, thinking maybe this was just part of adjusting to the new living arrangements. But the more I watched Jane and Emily settle in, the more alienated I felt. They had their own little world, and I was just an outsider looking in. It was hard to adjust to the fact that my dad had chosen to prioritize their needs over mine, especially when I was still reeling from losing my mom. Then the real bombshell dropped. One day, out of the blue, Dad sat me down for a serious talk. I could tell by his expression that this wasn't going to be good. He told me that since Emily was moving in, he thought it would be best if I considered moving out to make space for her. I was in disbelief. He actually suggested that I give my room to Emily because, according to him, she needed it more. He added that I could stay at my uncle's place temporarily while they adjusted to the new living arrangements. I wanted to scream and shout, but I remembered how Dad had reacted the last time I shared my thoughts about his marriage. So, I stayed calm, at least on the outside. I chose not to argue or get emotional and simply said, okay. Then I packed my bags, called my uncle, and moved out. My uncle, James, welcomed me with open arms. He was just as shocked as I was when I told him what had happened. It was only after I left that the reality of the situation hit me. My dad had chosen his new wife and stepdaughter over me, his own child, just months after my mom had passed away. The betrayal stung deeply. For a few days, I didn't hear from Dad. I assumed he was relieved that I had left without putting up a fight. It seemed like he didn't care enough to reach out, and I figured he was happy to have me out of the house. After all, he got what he wanted, right? Emily got my room, Jane got her new life with Dad, and I was out of the way. I remember sitting in my uncle's guest room, staring at my phone, half expecting some sort of apology or explanation, but there was nothing. It stung more than I expected. It felt like I'd been completely erased from his life. I kept telling myself that I did the right thing by leaving, trying to focus on getting settled at my uncle's place and keeping up with my college assignments. Then, out of nowhere, the silence broke. One day, my phone started blowing up with calls and texts from Dad. At first, I ignored them, assuming it was more of the same, adjusting talk he had given me before. But then it became relentless. Missed call after missed call, message after message. He was apologizing, asking me to come home, saying things could go back to normal. His tone had completely changed from when I left, and I started to get suspicious. Why this sudden desperation? I didn't respond at first, but the sheer volume of messages made me curious. Why was he so eager to get me back now? What had changed? Finally, I caved and texted him back, asking what was going on. That's when he told me about the letter. He tried to downplay it, but the more he talked, the more I realized something significant had happened. He mentioned receiving an official letter from my mom's estate attorney, which didn't make much sense to me at first. I knew my mom had a will. She had mentioned it in passing when she was sick, but I hadn't thought much about the details. Apparently, this letter was a big deal. My dad explained, in a roundabout way, that my mom's will had been finalized. According to the will, my mom had left her share of the house to me. That meant my dad and I were now co-owners of the house, me owning half and him the other half. While Dad still had his share, he couldn't sell the house or make any major changes to it without my consent. I guess I had assumed everything would go to Dad, given that they were married, but my mom had made sure I was taken care of. It hit me hard just how much thought she had put into it. Even though I wasn't yet 21, being 19 meant I had a legal stake in the house. I hadn't realized how significant that was until Dad started explaining that he couldn't make any major decisions about the property without my consent. This news completely shifted the dynamic. Now that Dad and Jane knew they needed me to stay in control of the house, they began spamming me with calls and texts nonstop. And it wasn't just them, they roped in the rest of the family. I started getting messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins, all telling me I needed to be the bigger person and go back home for the sake of family harmony. It was overwhelming. I'm a full-time college student and already have so much on my plate with classes, assignments, and a part-time job. The last thing I needed was this extra drama. The worst part was how Jane began messaging me too, acting all nice and trying to guilt me into returning. She even offered to let me share the room with Emily, as if that would make up for everything. It felt so disingenuous, like they were just trying to smooth things over because they realized they had lost control of the situation. They didn't care about my feelings until they realized they needed me. Now, they were trying to act like we were all one big happy family. Frankly, it was a lot to deal with. I didn't ask for any of this. All I really wanted was some time to grieve and process everything after losing my mom. Instead, I was stuck in this mess, feeling like I had to fight just to hold on to what my mom wanted me to have. Now, I don't know what to do. The house is legally half mine, but I'm not sure if I want to go back. For those asking, my uncle, let's call him Uncle James, is my mom's brother, not my dad's. He's been nothing but supportive, and I'm lucky to have him as a place to stay while I sort all of this out. There's been another development. While my dad's side of the family has been nonstop in their attempts to get me to come back, something interesting happened that I didn't see coming. My mom's lawyer paid me a visit at Uncle James's house. I wasn't expecting it, and honestly, it kind of caught me off guard. I had only met the lawyer once before, at the reading of my mom's will, but I didn't think I'd hear from him again, at least not anytime soon. When he showed up, my first thought was that something had gone wrong with the house or my legal rights over it. But it turned out to be something completely different. Apparently, my mom had set up a small trust fund for me, and the lawyer was there to explain the details. Uncle James is the trustee, which means he's in charge of managing the trust until I'm old enough to handle it on my own. The trust isn't anything huge, just a small amount of money that my mom had set aside for emergencies or future needs. I guess she wanted to make sure I had something to fall back on, especially if things got complicated with Dad and the house. The realization that she had thought of this made me feel even more protected by her. It was as if she had planned for every possibility, even the ones I never imagined. The trust fund doesn't completely change my financial situation, but it's comforting to know I have this extra security, especially with everything that's happening now. I haven't told my dad about the trust, and honestly, I'm not sure if I should. My mom must have set it up quietly, and since Uncle James is the trustee, it's likely Dad doesn't even know it exists. That thought made me feel more confident. For the first time, I felt like I had some control in this chaotic situation. However, it also made me wonder how my dad might react if he found out. Would it complicate things even more? Would he try to get involved, or even manipulate the situation to his advantage? These questions have been nagging at me. For now, I've decided to keep the trust fund quiet, following the advice of my lawyer. He emphasized that legally, my dad can't force me to move back or sell the house without my consent. Still, knowing how fixated he and Jane have become on the house, I can't help but feel that this whole situation will get even messier before it gets better. Meanwhile, Uncle James has been a rock through all of this. When my dad called him recently, trying to act concerned and asking if I was okay, Uncle James didn't hold back. He told Dad that I was staying with him as long as I needed to and made it clear that he wasn't going to pressure me into coming back. Dad tried to play the role of a concerned parent, but Uncle James wasn't buying it. He knows how Dad has treated me, and he's been fully supportive of me standing my ground. As for my dad's side of the family, their messages have shifted from polite requests to guilt-tripping. At first, they were saying things like, "Your dad misses you. You should come home." But when I didn't respond, their tone changed. Some started accusing me of being selfish, saying things like, "Family is more important than a stupid room," or "Your dad's under so much stress, and you're just making it worse." One and even told me I was being disrespectful to Dad and that I should move on because my mom was gone now. It's exhausting. I already have enough to deal with as a college student juggling assignments and a part-time job. The constant barrage of messages feels like a never-ending emotional attack, and it's hard not to feel overwhelmed. Every time I think this situation has reached its peak of awfulness, something else happens to turn everything upside down. Just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, leaving Dad's house, dealing with the endless messages, and finding out about the trust fund, another bombshell dropped. Yesterday, one of my cousins from Dad's side, let's call her Sarah, reached out to me, asking if we could meet for coffee. I wasn't sure what to expect, considering most of Dad's side has been pressuring me to go back home. But Sarah and I have always been close, so I agreed, hoping maybe she just wanted to check in. At first, the conversation was awkward. Sarah's mom, my aunt, has been one of the loudest voices trying to guilt me into reconciling with Dad. But then, out of nowhere, Sarah dropped a bomb on me that I wasn't prepared for. She hesitated, saying she wasn't sure if she should tell me, especially since her mom had told her to keep quiet about it. But she couldn't hold it in anymore. She felt I needed to know the truth. Sarah told me that my dad had been cheating on my mom for a long time, even before my mom got sick. I was completely floored. I had no idea this was going on. Sarah said she had known for a while but didn't want to get involved, mostly because her mom had told her not to. She explained that one day, before my mom passed away, she saw my dad at a restaurant with Jane. It wasn't just a casual lunch. Sarah said they looked like a couple, sitting close together, talking intimately, and clearly showing signs of a romantic relationship. At the time, Sarah didn't think too much about it. Maybe she didn't want to believe the worst, or maybe she didn't want to create drama. But now, looking back, it all started to make sense to her. The part that hit me the hardest was when Sarah told me she eventually gathered the courage to tell my mom about what she had seen. I can't even begin to imagine how devastating that must have been for my mom. She was already going through so much with her illness, and on top of that, she had to deal with the knowledge that my dad had emotionally, and maybe even physically, moved on before she was gone. Sarah said that after she told my mom, she felt guilty, like maybe she had made things worse. But at the time, she thought it was the right thing to do. She believed my mom had the right to know, even if it caused her pain. Ever since then, though, it's been weighing on Sarah's conscience, and she has struggled with whether or not telling my mom was the right decision. When Sarah told me all this, everything started to click into place. I think this might be why my mom made the decisions she did in her will. She probably knew about Dad and Jane, and maybe she didn't trust him anymore. Maybe that's why she left her share of the house to me instead of leaving everything to Dad. It was her way of protecting me and making sure that if Dad tried to move on too quickly with Jane, I wouldn't be left with nothing. It hurts to think that my mom was dealing with so much behind the scenes. She must have known that her time was limited, and on top of everything, she had to worry about Dad betraying her trust. I feel like I should have known, but I guess I was too focused on trying to cope with losing her to see the signs. Now, all these little things are starting to make sense. The way my mom would sometimes look at my dad with sadness in her eyes, the way she seemed so focused on making sure everything was in order before she passed away. I think she knew she had to take care of me because she couldn't count on Dad to do it. After Sarah told me all this, I felt sick to my stomach. It was like my whole perspective on my parents' relationship had been flipped upside down. I always thought they had a strong marriage. I never would have guessed that Dad was capable of something like this. I don't even know how to feel about him anymore. Part of me is furious that he could betray my mom like that, and part of me is just devastated that my mom had to carry that secret with her while she was sick. Now, I'm starting to wonder how much Jane knew about all this. Did she know my mom was still in the picture when she got involved with my dad? Was she just waiting for my mom to pass away so she could move in and take over? It makes me feel even more certain that I made the right decision by leaving the house. I don't want to be around people who treated my mom like that, especially not in the home she worked so hard to create for us. Since learning this, I felt even more conflicted about what to do next. I still own half of the house, but I don't know if I ever want to set foot in it again. How can I live there knowing all of this? How can I even look at my dad, after finding out what he did to my mom. And now it makes sense why Jane was so eager to push me out of the house. She probably saw me as an obstacle to fully taking over the life she wanted with my dad. Uncle James has been incredibly supportive through all of this. When I told him what Sarah said, he wasn't surprised. He admitted that he had always felt something was off with Dad after my mom got sick, but never had proof. He encouraged me to take my time making any decisions about the house and even offered to help me talk to a lawyer if I wanted to take any legal steps. For now, I'm trying to process everything and figure out what my next move should be. I don't think I can forgive my dad, at least not anytime soon. He's been pretending to be the victim in all of this, acting like I'm the one tearing the family apart. But now I see he's been hiding so much from me. After everything that's happened, I decided I needed to have a final conversation with my dad. This wasn't because I wanted to fix anything or make things better between us, but I felt like I needed to say my piece and make it clear that I didn't want any part of the life he and Jane were building. It wasn't an easy decision, but after finding out about the affair and realizing how much my mom had been through, I knew I couldn't just stay silent and walk away without closure. I messaged my dad, telling him I wanted to meet and talk. He was quick to respond, clearly thinking this was my way of coming back and reconciling. He and Jane had probably convinced themselves that I just needed time to cool off and that I'd come around eventually. When I showed up at the house without any bags or signs that I was moving back in, I could see the surprise on their faces. They were expecting me to be ready to move back in, but that wasn't happening. I sat down with them in the living room and the atmosphere was tense. Dad tried to start with small talk, asking how I was doing and if I was ready to move forward. Jane just sat there, fake smiling, clearly uncomfortable but still trying to act like everything was normal. It took everything in me to stay calm and not let my anger take over. But I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to let them control the narrative anymore. I told Dad straight up that I knew about the affair, that I knew he had been with Jane while Mom was still alive, and that someone had confirmed it for me. I didn't want to bring Sarah into it because I didn't want to cause trouble for her, but I made it clear that I knew the truth. The look on Dad's face was priceless, completely caught off guard. For once, he had nothing to say. Jane went pale and tried to deny it, stammering something about how it wasn't what it seemed, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. I had already heard enough from Sarah to know the truth. I explained that I wasn't there to argue or to get an apology. I just wanted them to know that I wasn't coming back. I told them that I didn't trust them, that I didn't want any part of the life they had built on lies, and that I wasn't going to pretend like everything was fine. I made it clear that the house, half of it at least, was mine, and I wasn't going to let them push me out. But I also wasn't going to live there. I told Dad I'd figure out what to do with my share later, but for now, I didn't want any contact with him or Jane. The one thing I made absolutely clear was that no decisions regarding the house should be made without me. Of course, Dad tried to play the victim. He said I was tearing the family apart, that I was overreacting, and that I needed to think about the future. He even tried to guilt me by saying how hard it had been for him after Mom died and that he needed someone to lean on, which was why Jane came into the picture. But I wasn't buying it. He made his choices, and now he had to live with them. I wasn't going to feel bad for him, especially after he had disrespected my mom long before she passed away. As for Jane, she just sat there quietly after I called them out. It was clear she wasn't going to take any responsibility for what had happened, and honestly, I didn't expect her to. I didn't care what happened between the two of them anymore. They had made their bed, and they could lie in it together. After I said my piece, I got up to leave. I could tell Dad was still in shock. He probably thought I'd come crawling back. But that was never going to happen. I walked out of the house feeling lighter than I had in weeks. It wasn't easy, but it felt good to finally have some closure, to say what needed to be said, and to let them know I wasn't going to be part of their lives anymore. Since that conversation, I've blocked both Dad and Jane on social media and stopped responding to any messages from my dad's side of the family. For the most part, it's been quiet, although Sarah told me that Dad has been telling people I'm the one acting out and being unreasonable. Honestly, I don't care anymore. People will believe what they want to believe, and I'm done trying to explain myself to anyone. As for the house, I haven't made any final decisions yet. My lawyer and Uncle James are helping me figure out the best way to handle it. I've been thinking about either selling my share or renting it out. I don't want to be tied to that house anymore, but I also don't want to give Dad and Jane any easy wins. If they want to stay there, they'll have to deal with the fact that I still have control over part of it, and I'm not going to let them make any big changes without my approval. This whole situation has been a wake-up call for me. I've learned that sometimes the people you trust the most can let you down in ways you never expected. But I've also learned that I'm stronger than I thought. I've made it through this mess with my head held high, and I'm ready to move forward on my own terms. As for Dad and Jane, I guess they got what they wanted. But in the end, they've lost something to me. Maybe in time, they'll realize that some things can't be undone. Karma has a way of catching up with people, and while I'm done with them, I can't help but feel like they'll eventually have to face the consequences of their actions. For now, I'm focusing on myself, my future, and the people who have truly been there for me throughout this ordeal. I'm not looking back.